All right, hello Algebra 1 students. Today we are going to learn how to solve radical equations. Let me try that again because I did not draw that very good. So solve radical equations. Now we could put in place of this, we could say instead of a radical, which is just this symbol here, we could say square root, okay? So we're going to solve equations that have square roots in them today. All right. So let's just get right into it and take a look at some examples. Now, remember, everything we've done so far, not everything, but we've solved a lot of equations with doing the opposite, right? Now, we can't solve quadratics that way. We have to use factoring or the quadratic formula, but we can solve square root functions by doing the opposite. Okay, so let's start off with this one. Square root of x plus 5 equals 13. Now, just like we do with regular equations, we want to get this square root over here by itself, right? So we're going to do the opposite. So this should be pretty familiar. We're going to subtract 5 on both sides. So we're left with the square root of x is equal to 8, right? Now, what's the opposite of the square root? Okay, well, the square root and the square root of x and x squared are opposites, okay? And so if I want to get rid of that square root function there, then I need to square both sides, okay? Because remember, just like we subtracted 5 on both sides, if I square both sides, that's a legal move in math because I'm doing the same thing to both sides. So the square root and the squared cancel, and I just get x, and then I square the 8, and I get 64, okay? And that's all we need to worry about for that type of problem, all right? Now, let's do our next equation. Let's do one that's a little bit harder. Let's do 3 minus the square root of x is equal to 0. Okay, and so again, we want to get rid of this 3 first, right? So we're going to subtract 3 on both sides. Now, this negative sign right here, though, we want to keep that. So we're going to have negative square root of x is equal to negative 3. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but back when we first started talking about square roots, square roots is one of the things that in math that you cannot do something. You cannot take the square root of a negative number. Now this is a negative over here, okay? But because there's a negative over here, I'm going to divide by -1 on both sides, and that'll make that a positive 3, okay? And then what? Well, square both sides. So now I get x equals 9. But if you ever get that square root to equal a negative, then you're going to have to say no solution, and that is something that could come up, okay? All right, so let's do another example, and each one's going to get a little more complicated as we go, okay? So if you'll notice, this one's got a little bit more going on, so I might need to write a little smaller here. Now, we have some things outside the square root, and we have some things inside the square root. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're getting everything that's outside the square root taken care of first. Okay, like we want to take care of those two things first before we start dealing with the inside, before we square both sides. Okay, so remember, we're going to do the opposite of the order of operations. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides first. So this 4 is going to stay. Square root of x plus 2 is going to stay. Excuse me. Equals 16. Okay. Now, how do I get rid of that 4? Right, we're going to divide by 4. It's being multiplied by the square root. So I'm going to divide by 4. So now I have the square root of x plus 2. Keep messing up that square root there. That plus equals 4. Now, there's nothing else outside of the square root that I got to get rid of. Okay, everything that's left over here is underneath the square root. Okay, so now I can go ahead and square both sides. Okay, now when I square the square root, again, it cancels because they're opposites. And so I get x plus 2 equals 16. Well, now I still have this plus 2 here. How do I deal with that? That's right. Do the opposite. And don't forget, guys, you guys can pause this video at any time if you want to, try to figure out the next step before I give it to you. Not a problem. And the nice thing is you can go back and rewind. I won't get mad because, I won't be there. So feel free to pause and rewind anytime. But the answer is x is equal to 14. Okay. All right. Next problem. I'm going to actually do one more, I think. Let's go ahead and do one. Let's go ahead and get a little crazy. Let's do this one. Let's do x plus 4 plus 7, that's a 4, is equal to 11. Okay, so try to go through this ahead of me, pause it, and to see what's next. So first step, right, we want to get rid of this plus 7. Subtract 7 from both sides. Gives me the square root of x plus 4 is equal to 4. So now we got the square root by itself. So now we can go ahead and square both sides. Okay. So now when I square the square root, they cancel. I get x plus 4 is equal to 16. Now you got to be careful right here because on this side, we just write x plus 4. We don't change anything because the squared and the square root. And so we might be tempted on this side just to write 4. But you have to remember to square this, okay, to get that 16. Now we have a nice little linear equation. So we're going to subtract 4 and subtract 4 and get x equals 12. Okay. All right. Last example that we're going to do today is going to get a little more complicated because what we're going to do is we're going to have 2 square roots. It's a little bit complicated, not really though. Well, how do we get rid of square roots? Right? We got to do the opposite. Well, what's the opposite of the square root? That's right, squaring both sides. So I'm going to square this side and I'm going to square this side, and it gets rid of both square roots. So I get 2x minus 1 is equal to x plus 4. So if there's a square root around it, I don't change anything on the inside. If there's not a square root, then I have to square it. Okay? All right. So what do I do next? Well, now I have a linear equation, right? So now I got to combine my x's, but they're on opposite sides, right? So I got to do the opposite. So I'm going to subtract x and I'm going to subtract x, right? So now I get 2x minus x is x minus 1 is equal to 4. Add 1 to both sides and I get x equals 5. Okay. What do you think? Again, I want to encourage you to pause this, rewind it, okay? We're going to do some more problems tomorrow on this very same thing, okay? But I want to try to break this up a little bit for you, okay? So we'll be looking on big ideas for your next assignment there, all right? All right, you guys have a good day.